Today we go over run up to the Civil War, the Gadsden Purchase, the Kansas-Nebraska Act, the Know Nothing Party, case of Dred Scott v. Sanford, Bleeding Kansas, the Compton Constitution, Lincoln Douglas debates, John Brown's raid, secession, and Crittenden Compromise. And the Civil War next time. Nation grows and expands. One set of problems solved, another one created. In the case of the United States, the same problem it had still exists, particularly the divisions over slavery. Other issues as well. For example, the Gadsden Purchase, 1853. Now what it is here is this tiny little sliver of New Mexico and southern Arizona. Because the Mexican cession, as it occurred, is only down to the Gila River. Gadsden Purchase is going to buy this little area right here. Round out the shape of the lower 48 states. Bought for $10 million by the U.S. Ambassador to Mexico, James Gadsden. The question, of course, is why that tiny little sliver of territory? It's got the rest of this whole area here for $5 million. So natural resources. Really, they don't know any about the gold deposits there yet. The gold rush you see in little towns like Tombstone don't come along to the 1880s. It's dry desert scrub brush. So what you have going through here, though, is the Continental Divide. See, out to the north of here is the Rocky Mountains. This is the one area of the Continental Divide. You know, the two has the continent where half the water runs down to one end of the ocean, the other half runs down to the other ocean, the Atlantic and Pacific. But the slope of the Continental Divide here is very smooth versus what you have further north. Jagged mountains. One coming to here they're talking about is Transcontinental Railroad. It's easier to build on a relatively smooth plain, even though it is desert, rather than try to go up and over a mountain or try to blast through it. Say railroads getting to be big business in the 1850s. All nations look forward to the day they can ride the train from Portland, Maine, all the way down to San Francisco, California. At the time without railroads, that would take weeks, months. Transcontinental Railroad, matter of a few days, less than a week. So in the Northeast, railroads are being built by the dozens. Thousands of miles of track being laid down, crisscrossing the entire Northeast. It's the latest technology, latest advance in transportation. It is changing the way American business is done, the way American people travel, the way American people communicate. The mail is being carried by train increasingly. People don't have to no longer see, they can see long lost relatives again fairly easily. Like I said, goods being produced on American farms being transported to market a lot easier. So a lot of people building these railroads, making a lot of money off of it. The idea is to connect the entire nation by rail. But this is going to be just one potential route for the Transcontinental Railroad. Several routes are being discussed. Potential hubs for the Transcontinental Railroad being discussed are New Orleans, Louisiana, Memphis, Tennessee, St. Louis, Missouri, and Chicago, Illinois. Those other routes, you can see, say from St. Louis or Chicago, basically have to go across the plains or through the mountains. Memphis or New Orleans, you come through a southerly route. And so, but there are problems with each one of them. One thing, Chicago, it's still a fairly small town, fairly minor city.
Even today?
Now, Chicago at that time was, but it's the railroad that makes it what it is today. Basically, a focal point for the entire continent. It's 3 million people today. Today, 1850, not even 100,000 people. All is going to change because of the railroad. You can go through Memphis, but the problem is no railroads in Arkansas in the 1850s. New Orleans, Louisiana, we got to get through all the swamps. The thing about southern Louisiana is it is swampy areas and marshes isolate large sections of that entire region. So you just can't build in a lot of areas because it's sitting on marsh. You sink right down to the bottom. If you're traveling on the interstates, major highways, notice it's basically everything is on stilts. Well, who gets the Transcontinental Railroad? That's going to be a huge debate in the 1850s. Each city, each region is wanting it. But the Gadsden Purchase was just one part of it. But unfortunately, though, this southern railway, southern route of the Transcontinental Railroad, is not built until 1886. It's going to be happening as a northern route. And that's going to be completed in 1869. But once they start completing the network, other transcontinental routes start filling in fairly quickly. But in the meantime, there are other issues being discussed, particularly Cuba. Pierce is part of a movement, President Franklin Pierce is part of a movement to try to acquire Spanish Cuba for the United States. Seen as a move to expand the United States and gain slave territory for the South. Now see, Cuba had been claimed by the Spanish since 1492. Been the base Spanish operations in the the Caribbean for centuries. And basically Spain's milking it for everything it's got. It's got a lot of sugar plantations, therefore a lot of slavery. Well, Pierce is trying to negotiate with the Spanish officials for it. He's offering up to $130 million for it. It's a lot of money those days. But Spain's making so much more money off of it, they're saying no. But Pierce is actually planning with the military officials that if Cuba is going to turn down America's offer for it, the United States would go to war with Spain over Cuba. But before the plan starts falling into place, northern newspapers caught wind of the plan and condemned the effort to go to war just to gain more slave territory. Northern abolitionists, enraged, denounced Pierce over it, and Pierce had to back off, so no war with Cuba in 1853. 1854 comes along. Back to the railroad. Well, comes down to this man, Senator Stephen Douglas of Illinois. Like I say, being from Illinois, he wants Chicago to be the hub of the Transcontinental Railroad. But the problem is, though, to push for it, they're going to have to push through a lot of unorganized territory here in the Great Plains. It's going to through Illinois to Iowa to middle of nowhere to more unorganized territories, basically Utah Territory, then to California. Missouri, St. Louis have the same problem. Memphis and New Orleans is lately going through a lot of reasonably settled territory. Arkansas, Texas, and so forth. But the problem the South has is it doesn't have a lot of east-west routes for railroads yet. And during the Civil War especially won't. The few railroads that exist in the South in the 1850s are all north-south routes. They just don't have that network to push them back to the east. Again, because where's all the money going again? So in order to try to raise the stakes and improve Illinois' chances of getting the Transcontinental Railroad, Douglas proposes the Kansas-Nebraska Act, or what will become the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Basically try to organize this area, the remainder of the Louisiana Purchase, into territories. So, originally, he proposes the entire area, as you see here on page 454, whole green area, into the territory of Nebraska. The whole thing just be Nebraska. But here's the thing, Missouri Compromise. Remember, slavery had been banned in that territory under that agreement. I'd say Southern supporters of slavery had hoped that this area would never be as settled, or at least be delayed a lot longer than it is, but for Douglas, an ambitious man with his eyes on the presidency, this was the time. But he realized the South would object to it as being organizing a free territory, even though the Missouri Compromise said slavery is illegal here. For all deal is a deal. But for the South, they're increasingly upset by the imbalance in numbers. 1854 had not been a slave state admitted since Texas. Since that time, you've had Iowa, Wisconsin, California, all admitted as free states. No more slave territory remaining. But to get the votes through the Senate, Douglas realizes he's going to have to try to give Southerners some kind of concession to it. So he writes popular sovereignty into the bill, saying the people can vote on the slavery issue for themselves. But since he still can't bring slavery into the area, the free farmers are going to vote for a free state. Southerners object to this, saying the vote's already stacked against them. So Douglas responds to this by essentially rewriting the entire bill, reorganizing it as the Kansas-Nebraska Act, creating two territories. Both would have popular sovereignty written into them. And the ban on slavery was repealed. Essentially, what had been a deal is a deal no more. So now people can bring their slaves into those territories if they want. Well, Douglas personally preferred the territories remain free, but he hoped popular sovereignty would carry the day, that is, the democratic process. But he underestimated one very important thing: the symbolism that the Missouri Compromise created. See, since 1820, there have been a lot of little sectional crises erupting. But Missouri Compromise had always held, 34 years. The principle that a deal is a deal. So the American people, the Missouri Compromise, represented the idea that no matter how bad things were between North and South, the two sides could sit down together and make a deal. They could make an agreement. Lasting, binding agreement. Great American principle. Make a deal. So, what Douglas ended up doing in this process was taking away that stability the American people had relied on for decades. That sense of security, that sense of closure, security, gone.
Was this also the reason why Douglas failed to become a presidential candidate?
He would in 1860, but it basically kind of derailed his presidential ambitions. See, what he's proposing here has become so politically radioactive. The Carolines will try to be running as far from it as they can. Well, Douglas is a good legislator. He's able to convince people to vote particular bills. President Pierce comes out in favor of the compromise because Douglas, all he's trying to do is organize these areas into territory so he can have that railroad go through. That's his main priority. Slavery is really kind of an afterthought for him, but it's the elephant in the room. The one thing no one wants to talk about, but now everything's all coming out. Well, as a result of this, President Pierce comes out and backs the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Still on a controversy over the entire bill. And it ends up passing the House a vote of 113 to 100. The Senate passed by a vote of 37 to 14. One of the senators voting against this bill was Senator Sam Houston of Texas. He objected on numerous grounds, including tribal treaties, but because Houston voted against it, the Texas state legislature voted not to send it back to the Senate. Basically kicked him out of office over it. Well, this is how bad it gets. So you've got two territories, the Nebraska Territory and the Kansas Territory. Well, Kansas is right next door to slaveholding Missouri. In fact, the bulk of the population still lives today in Kansas is in eastern Kansas, the Kansas City area, and so forth. And you have all these slave states' quarters end up flooding across the Missouri border into Kansas. You have slave states' quarters coming in from Missouri, but you got free states' quarters coming in from places like Iowa and Illinois. It's creating a volatile mix here. Southerners assumed because they created two territories open to slavery, Kansas was meant for slave territory, to become a slave territory and a slave state, and Nebraska for free states. Said Douglas didn't say anything about that one way or another, just said two territories open to popular sovereignty. Well, people are enraged over this. The Missouri Compromise has been repealed. Create a whole new argument over territorial slavery. People were incensed that their congressmen and senators were supporting it. Basically, it ended up upsetting the entire existing political order in the American government. In 1854 midterm elections here. The Democratic Party is the majority party, 160 seats going into the election. The Whigs, second party, 73 votes, 73 members. The American Party, third. Democratic Party down to 84, loss of 76 seats. Whig Party down to 60, loss of 13 seats. That pretty much finishes off the Whig Party. Then you have two new parties, the American Party and the new Republican Party. The Republican Party forms as a protest over the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Basically, Americans are abandoning the existing political parties. They're so furious at the political process. The American Party goes up to 62 seats, becoming the second largest political party in the country overnight. Republicans go from non-existence to 46 seats. This whole thing finishes off the Whig Party, what was left of it. The strains over slavery had finally destroyed them once and for all. They could never, Whig Party, remember, spent on a very weak set of principles, primarily their opposition to Andrew Jackson. Jackson's been dead since 1845. The only presidential candidates they ever had that won were war heroes. Essentially, just being opposed to the Democratic Party. But let's pretty much finish them off. Now, the question is what's going to happen to these remaining Whigs here. The Whig Party's dead. They're not going to run another candidate after this.
No more Whigs?
No more Whigs. So we get to the American Party, which got the unfortunate nickname the Know-Nothing Party. It's called the American Party, or the Order of the Star-Spangled Banner. It's a nativist party. Basically, they are completely opposed to immigration in all its forms. So fearing what immigrants coming into the United States can do to American culture, American economics, their jobs, everything. Just terrified of these immigrants coming ashore, even though they may be the sons or grandchildren of immigrants themselves. Basically, they got here and wanted to slam the door shut. Now, fearing competition from cheap immigrant labor, fearing the large numbers of Roman Catholic immigrants coming in from Ireland, they call for expanding the citizenship residency requirement from 5 years up to 21 years. Basically, you have to live here for 21 years before you're able to vote. I said, we had to wait 21 years, why shouldn't these immigrants? Supported prohibition. Essentially, that's a slur against the Irish. Saying the Irish are a bunch of drunken brawlers. Viciously anti-Catholic. They hate Roman Catholics. Some of the state organizations are calling for investigations of Catholic schools, convents, everything else for any kind of illegal activities or suspected radicalism. A lot of Whigs leftists joined the Know-Nothing Party, looking for a new political home. Now, they got called the Know-Nothings because they're a secretive society. Basically, secret clubhouse, secret handshake kind of thing was popular in the 1850s. Like I say, it's an organization for men only, because women can't vote in 1854. And because it's a secretive organization, they're told what to say about their meetings, to simply say, "I know nothing." It's back to Sergeant Schultz again. And let's say somebody said, "I know nothing," they got caught the nickname Know Nothings. Scored stunning successes in the midterm elections of 1854, probably because other people were in office and they had no position on slavery or the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Their whole focus is immigration. Remember, the 3 million immigrants coming into the country, 20 million in early 1850s. Like I say, they won 61 seats in more seats in Congress, won complete control of government in Massachusetts, where so many immigrants are coming into the country. In 1855, they swept 3 more New England states, won Maryland, scored strong wins in Kentucky and Texas. It looks like they're poised to win in 1856. When all of a sudden, in 1856, they collapse and vanish. So the great irony, though, is the 1856 election, the party is built on anything but slavery. It's destroyed on the issue of slavery. The Northern and Southern Know Nothing split on it. Both furious over the lack of mention or position over slavery in the Know Nothing platform. Northern Know Nothing said Southern Know Nothings are trying to prevent slavery from being mentioned because they're trying to spread slavery all over the country. Southerners are blaming accusing Northerners just the opposite, trying to strangle and end slavery. What ends up happening, though, is after the mid-1850s is you have this decline in immigration. Immigration is no longer such an issue. And you have competition from another political party, the Republican Party. So you got all these uncertainties in 1850s politics. People are latching on to something they can rely on. Now, the new Republican Party is committed to free soil ideology. There's a lot of conscience wigs and free soilers end up joining the Republican Party. The Free Soil Party, free soil, but it's basically they're opposed to expanding slavery into the territories. Keep slavery contained where it is. Which meant they're opposed to the Kansas-Nebraska Act. As the Whigs disintegrate, a lot of Northern Whigs are joining the Republican Party. Some Northern Democrats, too. Like I said, not as openly anti-Catholic, but showed a clear preference for evangelical Protestants. And they gained more voters by arguing against the Southern slaveholders' plot to destroy freedoms in America, rather than some plot by the Pope and the Roman Catholic Church to destroy American liberty. Because basically, the Know Nothing said the Pope is going to take over America through all these immigrants, because Catholic immigrants are going to do exactly what the Pope tells them to do, which completely misunderstands what the Pope does in the Catholic Church. Republicans, they don't like Catholics, but they're arguing more about slavery, more immediate issue. So you get to the 1856 election. As you have this point is Kansas in turmoil over free state, slave state factions slugging it out. Rival governments claiming control of the territory. John C. Fremont hero of the Mexican War, is nominated by the Republican Party, their first presidential candidate. Nominated were establishment politicians like William Henry Seward and so forth. It's kind of a celebrity nomination, going more for flash than for substance. Fremont was an abolitionist. Won a great deal of fame for his exploits in California during the Mexican War as an explorer called the Great Trailblazer. James Buchanan of Pennsylvania is nominated by the Democrats. Say, where was he when all this was going on with the Kansas-Nebraska Act? He was ambassador to England. They tried to find somebody, anybody, not even closely connected to it. Not connected to the act. The know-nothings go with former President Millard Fillmore. Saying, you know you've got problems, and I think the answer is Millard Fillmore. The Whigs don't put forward candidates. They're gone forever. On all this campaigning, Fillmore ends up winning only the state of Maryland. Know-nothing's been doing fairly well in Massachusetts. Goes for Fremont. But Fremont does surprisingly well, wins 11 out of 16 free states. Buchanan edged them in 4 major free states after the presidency, getting 45.3% of the vote, 174 electoral votes. Fremont getting about a third, 33.1%, 114 electoral votes. Fillmore, 21.6%, 8 electoral votes. So fairly close in the popular column, but shakes out in the electoral vote. So after this, Buchanan is elected, and the Democrats are basically the only remaining national party. The only party with organizations in both North and South. So the know-nothings are gone, the Whigs are gone, the Republicans exist only in the North. The Republicans will not be on the ballot in the South until after the Civil War. And Buchanan turns out to be probably the worst president of American history. The presidency is a disaster from the start. As Buchanan takes office, there's a case running through the Supreme Court, Dred Scott v. Sanford. In Buchanan's inaugural address on March 4th, 1857, he urged the Supreme Court to rule broadly on slavery issues and territorial issues involved with this case, try to put the slavery issue to rest once and for all. Well, the Supreme Court does. The result is probably one of the worst judicial decisions in history. See, Dred Scott was a slave born in Virginia in 1800. His owner had been an army surgeon, had taken him to the Wisconsin Territory for the time of the 1830s. After his owner's death, Dred Scott sued for his freedom, claiming he lived for so long in an area which slavery was banned, that is namely Wisconsin and Minnesota, that he should be considered to be a free man. Simply because where he was, slavery is illegal, he should not be considered a slave. The Missouri Compromise had banned slavery in these territories, particularly in Minnesota. And so the Supreme Court issues its ruling on March 6, 1857. Chief Justice was Roger B. Taney of Maryland, a Jackson appointee, and a slaveholder. You know this is not going to go well. Essentially, if you want to look at the Dred Scott case, it comes down to one question. Either once free, always free, or once a slave, always a slave. Well, the Supreme Court says basically, once a slave, always a slave. Said that Taney ruled that no black could ever be a citizen of the United States. The Missouri Compromise was unconstitutional, and Congress had no right to declare slavery unconstitutional to Wisconsin Territory. Essentially, they cut off all possible avenues of compromise. that slavery could expand over the entire whole of the United States, and the Bill of Rights was for whites only. Echoing the argument you see hearing more and more in the 1850s that America was a country for white men. Taney echoed that. So he said there will be no compromise possible over slavery because the Missouri Compromise is unconstitutional. Congress had no right to declare slavery illegal in the territories. Blacks could never even become citizens. There are several major glaring errors in his reasoning right off the start, because the Constitution clearly says Congress can pass all laws necessary for the territories. So it's plain as day. Like I said, slavery, citizenship, that was a congressional question. Congress had the rules to decide issues of citizenship. Several states had declared African Americans to be citizens. Well, the nation exploded over the decision. The South praised it as a vindication of their beliefs, but in the North, is announced as a wicked and false judgment. The Republican Party made a lot of political hay out of arguing that slavery interests now controlled all three branches of government. The word you keep hearing at this point is slaveocracy. Government of, by, and for slave interests. Now, juries in Illinois and Wisconsin Territory had ruled Dred Scott to be a free man. So the Sanford family, who basically had inherited Dred Scott, they're basically trying to push this to the Supreme Court as a test case. Basically trying to see one way or another how this issue is going to be ruled over slaves that is happily brought into the North. Dred Scott himself is never brought back into slavery. But his attempt to try to bring this case before the Supreme Court proves to be a disaster for the entire nation, because the deck was already stacked against them. Now consider where we are in 1857. The nation has been plagued by a steady stream of crises pitted north against south, territorial slavery, states' rights, tariffs, rights to fugitive slaves, and so on, all coming down to the issue of slavery. The spirit of compromise and cooperation that marked the Missouri Compromise is gone. There are few leaders of significant national stature in place in 1857. The nation suffered under a succession of weak presidencies. Not since 1837 did a president serve 2 terms, the last one being Andrew Jackson. Next one's going to be Abraham Lincoln. So you have a quarter century or so between the end of Jackson's presidency and the beginning of the Civil War, leaving a generation of weak presidencies in a time of festering national crisis. So look who you got in the meantime. Harrison and Taylor, old war heroes, both died in office. Van Buren, who had been an able politician, was hounded out of office in 1840. James K. Polk was a strong and effective leader, but he retired and died months after leaving office. Served only 1 term in office. John Tyler managed a couple of clever accomplishments, but never had any substantial support. Couldn't even get renominated for president in 1844. These other 3, Pierce, Fillmore, and Buchanan, they've become synonymous with mediocrity. Men of little note before, during, or after their presidencies. Few accomplished any notes during their careers or their presidencies. Did little and accomplished little while the nation tore itself apart. Basically, just sat there and let the whole country disintegrate. Pierce and Buchanan were known as what they called dough faces. 1850 slang term meaning basically northern men with southern sympathies, basically northern supporters of slavery. So in the middle of all this, bleeding Kansas. Essentially, it's a civil war in the Kansas territory over whether it's going to be a free territory or slave territory. You have slave state supporters rushing in from next door Missouri. You have free state supporters coming in from Iowa and Illinois. And erupts into a bloodbath. It's running raids by pro-slavery or pro-free state factions, running back and forth. Gunfights, massacres. In the fall of 1856, 200 people died in Kansas. One massacre after another. Day in, day out. The nation is shocked by it. Basically, this is a preview of the coming Civil War. Well, in early 1857, the territorial legislature of Kansas called for an election of delegates to a state constitutional convention. Basically, they're going to come in as a state and settle this issue once and for all. Here's the problem, though, is the Kansas Constitutional Convention comes into effect. The whole deck of cards is stacked against the free state forces. There's no provision for referendum on voting for a constitution, and the territorial governor vetoes the measure. But the territorial legislature overrides the veto, and in disgust, the governor resigns. Well, President Buchanan names Robert Walker now as a territorial governor of Kansas. The territorial governors were appointed by the president. Walker had been a unionist, started a political career in Mississippi, was a former member of the cabinet during the Polk administration. He's excited about the opportunity. Actually, he's hoping to prove that popular sovereignty can work, using Kansas as a test case. Walker, even though he's from Mississippi, he's hoping to bring Kansas into the Union as a free, democratic state. Prove that popular sovereignty can and will work. Well, Walker arrived in May 1857, pledged to free state support as they received fair election, but didn't understand what's happening in Kansas. Everything's already stacked against him. It's already rigged by slavery supporters. So he's unable to convince free state supporters to vote for delegates in the convention. So what happens, because free state supporters are boycotting it, the whole convention is dominated by slave state supporters. The convention approves a constitution that makes slavery legal, but again stacks the deck. The referendum on the Constitution, the only choice is to support a Constitution with slavery or support the Constitution without slavery. But either way, slavery as it existed in Kansas was not to be interfered with. Basically, you can have the Constitution with or without slavery, but you're still getting slavery. Your choice is slavery or slavery. Now, Kansas has only 200 slaves at this point. So not a lot when compared to places like Arkansas or Missouri or Kentucky. That 200 is an important symbol for both sides. Either way, what could be. A Kansas flooded with slaves or a free state. Or is 200 just going to be the first of thousands, tens of thousands? Or is 200 going to be the last, going to be freed soon? Slave state supporters said they'll be the first. Well, free state supporters boycott the election on the grounds that this election's rigged. And this Constitution they approved, the Compton Constitution, this is the pro-slavery Kansas Constitution, met at the city of Compton, village of Compton. Well, in their election in December 1857, Kansas voters vote 12-1 in favor of Lecompton. Free State supporters boycotted. While discussed about the entire procedure, Walker resigns in disgust. The acting governor then reconvenes the anti-slavery dominated territorial legislature. Anti-slavery forces come to dominate it again. And then calls for an election vote up or down on the Lecompton Constitution. None of this for the Constitution with slavery, for the Constitution without slavery. They vote 12-1 in favor of the Constitution with slavery this first time. Now they're calling for a second election, up or down on the Constitution. So 2 weeks later, January 1858, hold a second election. 10,000 voting against the Constitution. Only 138 for the Constitution with slavery. And there are 24 votes for people voting for the Constitution without slavery. But basically, 10,000 voting down the whole thing. Basically, 90-1 against. Well, this time the slave state supporters boycotted. But in spite of this, in spite of the up and down vote, the second vote voting against it, Buchanan, under pressure from slave state supporters, backs the Lecompton Constitution. Says this will be the legitimate Constitution of Kansas. Kansas will be admitted as a slave state. Well, this causes a serious division now within the Democratic Party between pro and anti-Lecompton Democrats. Stephen Douglas and another faction of Democrats breaks with Buchanan over this. Douglas is denounced by the South in the process. And in March 1858, Buchanan pushes the Lecompton Constitution through the Senate. But in the House of Representatives, Congress pushes through a measure calling for a third vote on the measure, this time carefully supervised by the federal government. So in August 1858, the third election on the issue, Kansas voters reject the Lecompton Constitution again by a vote of 11,300 to 1,788. So the people voted twice on this issue and twice said no. Kansas remains firmly in the hands of the anti-slavery legislature. They declare themselves to be free territory. The remaining territories to the north are unlikely to introduce slavery. So the immediate question of slavery in the territories resolved still carried a great deal of symbolism. The situation Buchanan was compounded by a brief financial panic of 1857. Well, now you get to 1858. Well, Compton battle put a severe strain on the remaining National Party, the Democrats. Douglas faces re-election to the Senate in 1858 against the Buchanan Democrats and the Republicans. Republicans in Illinois chose Abraham Lincoln to run against Douglas. Lincoln had been a lawyer in Illinois, former legislator, one-term congressman. Pretty much retired from politics, but the Kansas-Nebraska debate brought him back into politics. And even though the whole election is going to be decided in the legislature, because the common man doesn't vote for the Senate in the 1850s, not until 1917, Lincoln is challenging Douglas to a series of debates across the state of Illinois. Well, Lincoln's going around, challenges them to these debates, and eventually the two agree to 7 debates across the entire state of Illinois. This came to be known as the Lincoln-Douglas debates. It became a series of famous debates on the nature of slavery. In fact, so famous that debate teams actually now have a style debate called Lincoln-Douglas debate, where basically one person stands up arguing for or against the resolution. The other one stands up arguing for or against the resolution, asking questions back and forth, and then they have their concluding arguments. But Lincoln, I say he's a clever speaker. Charmed the crowds with his homespun charm, his jokes, very self-effacing sense of humor. Once Lincoln was a lawyer, he's a clever man. He was defending a man for murder, and the guy on the stand said that he saw his client running from the scene of the crime by the light of the full moon. Lincoln pulled out an almanac and said, "No, it's impossible. This almanac says the moon wasn't out that night." The client was acquitted. Well, Lincoln's a simple, unassuming man, has a very deep wisdom, very clever. He said the half-slave, half-free arrangement in the country, that a house divided against itself cannot stand. This nation cannot endure half-slave and half-free. He belittled Douglas's statements by saying, you can fool all the people some of the time and some of the people all the time, but you can't fool all the people all the time. Very famous remark. A lot of people have tried to fool all the people all the time, but it's very self-effacing. He's able to make fun of himself. One comment, Douglas called Lincoln two-faced. Lincoln responded by saying, my opponent calls me two-faced. Now, my friends, I ask you this. If I had another face, would I use this one? Douglas tries to reconcile popular sovereignty with the Dred Scott decision. Said slavery could not exist anywhere unless supported by local police regulations. Basically, that law enforcement had to basically enforce slavery for it to exist. The Republican Party does well in Illinois, but Douglas carries the election in the legislature. What it ends up doing is it sharpens the ideological focus of the Republican Party and makes Lincoln a national figure. In 1855, Peru abolished slavery in South America. At this point, only left in the Western Hemisphere, Brazil, Cuba, Puerto Rico. Cuba and Puerto Rico are both controlled by Spain. Dutch Guiana and the Dutch West Indies. And the American South is the only place that still had slavery. So moving into 1858 and 1859, you have this crisis atmosphere, a series of events throughout the country convincing Southerners that they were directly threatened. They're paranoid, they're scared to death, convinced everybody's about to get them. One particularly felt threatened for their safety and for their personal positions. And John Brown's raid makes things even worse. Now, Brown had led the raids in Bleeding Kansas against pro-slavery forces. In fact, his son had been killed in one of these raids. But in 1859, he's firmly committed to abolishing what he called the wicked curse of slavery, and decided to take his cause directly to the South. Felt he was God's personal instrument to, in his words, purge this land with blood.
Wasn't he executed in the end?
He will be, yes. October 16th, 1859. Essentially, his plan is to steal weapons from the U.S. Army arsenal at Harper's Ferry, Virginia, arm slaves, and launch a slave insurrection. Basically, a violent revolution to overthrow slavery in the South. He leads 22 men on this night, including 5 free blacks, across the Potomac River into Virginia, and he occupies the federal arsenal of Harper's Ferry. Well, everything ends up going wrong. He ends up having to flee the arsenal. He and his men hole up in the local fire engine house until he's surrounded by militiamen and angry townspeople. He sent his son out to surrender, and somebody in the crowd shoots and kills him. Befuddled by the collapse of his insurrection, Brown continues to hold out. The U.S. Army sends in their nearest senior officer, Lieutenant Colonel Robert E. Lee, to assert control of the garrison. The following morning, October 18th, sent Lieutenant Jeb Stewart in to break down the doors of the firehouse. Basically, they're going to break into the place, try to capture them. Stewart manages to capture 7, including Brown. 5 more escaped, 10 more died in the firefight. Brown is then turned over to authorities in Virginia and tried and convicted for treason against the Commonwealth of Virginia. That's trying to make war against Virginia. He is convicted, sentenced to death.
On October 16th, right?
He's captured on October 18th. So it starts on October 16th. He's captured on the 18th. On December 2nd, he's hanged in Charlestown, Virginia. Just a little over a month later. In the north, solemn observances met the news of Brown's death. Church bells ringing as if for a funeral. In the south now saw the Republican Party full of John Browns ready to leap into Dixie and to spark these insurrections. You have rumors of slave uprisings, conspiracies, and insurrections throughout the winter of 1859-1860. Northerners are forced out by angry Southerners. The situation made even worse by the election of a Speaker of the House of Representatives in December 1859. The Republican Party gained control of Congress. John Sherman of Ohio was chosen as House Speaker. Seemed a logical choice, but he swore distribution of a book called The Impending Crisis of the South. Distributing across the South. The Impending Crisis of the South was a book written in 1857 by a man named Hinton Helper. And essentially, what Helper said was slavery had impoverished the South. Well, on paper, states like Mississippi were the wealthiest state in the nation. That was only because of slavery, because you're counting people as money. And so, but looking at the real crisis of the South, take away slavery, the South was deeply impoverished. The South was very poor, it was backwards. No education facilities, very poor transportation facilities, no industry. That slavery had masked the real poverty of the South. And Hinton Helper says the only way to do this is the free farmers in the South are going to have to rise up and overthrow the planters. You have to get rid of them, get rid of slavery. But essentially what Hinton Helper is calling for here is a revolution. One that horrified the planters and led to the book being banned across the South. And Sherman, incoming House Speaker, supports distributing this book. Well, people were furious over this. It cost Sherman the speakership, calling Southerners to abolish slavery, and Sherman's stripped of the speakership. William Pennington of New Jersey is chosen as House Speaker instead. Pennington was a free soil supporter. Had nothing to do with this book. But in the meantime, you have others in Congress, such as Senator Jefferson Davis, calling for federal protection of slavery as a federal slave code. And all this is what's running into the election year of 1860.